Anastasia, go ahead and. All right. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the City of Kenmore Diversity, Equity, Inclusion meeting to order for March 10th, 2022, Thursday, and I will now take the roll. I'd like to ask if you could please turn on your cameras as I say your name to let us all know that you're verbally present. Thank you. All right, I will call attendance. Darlene Ademba. Juanita Aguilar.
Present.
David Arthur. David Arthur. Marco Ballesteros.
Present.
Lily Bishop.
Present.
Bill Castro. Bill Castro. Peggy Evans.
Here.
Jeannie Galloway. Jeannie Galloway. I'm taking attendance. Good evening.
Good evening.
So you're present. Okay.
I am.
Got a little skill.
Here, here.
Juliana Pulley.
Here.
Nancy Ty. Nancy Ty. Are you with us?
Present. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you, Nancy.
Oh, thank you.
Aisha. Aisha Jallo. Aisha. Okay. Darlene Ademba, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, fantastic. Clerk, is there anybody else that I had left out that I haven't called? Nobody else? So I just wanted to let you know that we have 2 outgoing members and 1 replacement who you all will be meeting in a few minutes. So Leslie McGuire and Parker Travis are outgoing members. However, we have a new Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Task Force member that I'd like to introduce you to. His name is Sam Otis. And Sam, if you could please share with the group who you are and why you're here, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Greetings all. My name's Sam Otis. I am a Vietnamese American. I live in Kenmore and I have my whole life. My mom's a Vietnamese refugee. She came over here when she was like 4. And my dad's white, but I take after my mom. I became passionate about advocacy after in 8th grade, I had a racist teacher calling me slurs a lot. And basically the administration didn't do anything about that. And it's kind of like plagued me throughout going through school. So I kind of am passionate about advocacy. So no other kids have to go through the same stuff I did.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing your story, and welcome to the DEI task force. All right, next on our list are public comments. So it's now time for public comment. We'd love to hear from you. So please raise your hand now if you wish to speak, and the clerk will promote you, and you have 2 minutes to give comments. Clerk, do we have any individuals who are raising their hand from the community?
Thank you, Leonora. I don't see any hands raised, but maybe we'll give it just a hot minute to see if people need to find that button. Go ahead and raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. And by the way, I have Nancy Meehan with me in the background today. There's
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
So Nancy and I are, for the purposes of these meetings, are one and the same. We're both clerks. I still don't see any hands raised. So, and then I'll pivot away from public comment for just a second to note that Jeffrey Pooley is here. And I'm wondering if that's actually Juliana Pooley.
No, I'm here. I'm Juliana.
Okay.
Yes, I just have a husband who listens to everything. He was on a previous Kenmore task force, so
Hey, okay, well, in that case, I'm going to disable talking. Not that we
yes,
don't want to
please.
hear from him, but wow,
No, no.
what a supportive partner. Kudos to him. Awesome. Okay, is there anyone that would like to give comment this evening? Any of our attendees? Okay, Leonora, I don't hear any interest.
Okay, thank you, Anastasia. So I'm going to move into the approval of the minutes. And at this point, we move on to the approval of the minutes, which you received prior to the meeting. And I will suggest that we approve the minutes through unanimous consent. All in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Okay, any opposed? Okay, that being said, we'll move on to the next agenda items. And this is where Shannon, you will, I'm gonna let you take the wheel. We will be addressing our DEI organizational review insights, Kenmore community scan findings, and finally a community survey design task force input. Shannon.
Thank you. So, as you all know, the reason that you folks have been so generous in your time and why we've seated you as an advisory task force is to essentially be able to partner and collaborate with us in the implementation, design, and execution of the organizational equity assessment with an end goal in terms of a deliverable to come up with a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy for the city to improve the access and opportunity and improve outcomes for all people, both folks in the community as well as staff. So part of that process meant that we needed to do a scan of the community to look at the demographics that make up the community of Kenmore. But also importantly is the organizational assessment in terms of document review. So what happened was the city of Kenmore shared with us 9 different documents highlighting both process, procedural, policy, and some governance structure for different parts of the organization, especially those that are impactful of workforce and workplace, as well as things that happen across the community. And so we did a SWOT analysis of those documents. And we have the results and findings of that. And I wanted to be able to walk you through that and share that with you. And then I want to be able to engage with you in a robust conversation to talk about your insights, any ideas that you have, and to talk about community perspective, yours specifically, and then information or guidance on what we present. So I am going to share my screen and then walk you through what we've got. So here we go. Okay. So we're gonna present findings, engage in discussion, and then I'm hoping to get your insight. And who am I? For those of you that don't know, either in the community, attending as community engaged members and attendees today, but especially for those on the task force and SAMU as well. I am Channing Kelly Ray. I am the founder and principal of Channing Kelly Ray Consulting. I've done the work that I do for more than 20 years globally. I've worked across most industries. I have a global team of 11 folks that do the work that we do. And what I like to say is we work with organizations to help them become better versions of themselves. I'm a Washington state-based business with also with operations, at least in the US, in the state of Arizona, as well as Florida, Texas, and Washington State. So minority woman-owned business, happy to be doing this work. And that's kind of who I am. And then let's jump into what we're going to talk about. So essentially, when you do the work that is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, there are really 8 different drivers or 8 key drivers that inform the work. These are those 8 things that you have to build for, assess, and grow for that impact experience across every dimension of difference in the human population that you engage, whether it's a business or a city government or even community-based organizations or just what happens in your neighborhood. Those things that we found to be true across all of those populations when you're trying to grow and improve something for individuals to explore opportunities for growth, access, and improving outcomes. The things that you must consider as always, diverse representation, or participation that can be enjoyed by people of all backgrounds and experiences. Remember, diversity is all of the ways that humans experience difference. Psychological safety and voice. Can people bring their full voices and their full selves without the fear of retribution, retaliation, or negative impact as a result of sharing their voice? Transparency and accountability. An organization having ownership for their results and actions and then sharing that information so that they can be held responsible for delivering on those promised results. Equitable rules and systems, the policies, processes, and procedures that produce equal access, justice, and equity for all people. Shared benefit and mutual interest, individual and or collective goals where desired outcomes are achieved together. So one group doesn't benefit to the detriment of others. We want to create a system where everyone can share in the opportunity and benefit and wealth of whatever you endeavor to do. Belonging and connection, trust, value, and respect as part of the whole. Being invited in and knowing that you are not an outsider in the space that you help to occupy. So feeling connected to the space, feeling like it was meant for you to be there, and you're not an outsider that is an interloper in the space that people are calling yours that is shared. Value and accept differences. The incorporation of diverse lived experiences, diverse insights, diverse perspectives into the decision making. Making sure that when we invite all those voices to the table, we listen to learn and incorporate that learning. And then, of course, I think that this is probably the most important thing, having a commitment to change, the will, desire, and promise to actively work toward a desired state where everyone can thrive as both individuals and as part of the group. So this is what we're building. This is the lens through which we build and do this work. So as part of the organizational summary overview, we did a SWOT analysis through a DEIB lens to look at governance and leadership for the city of Kenmore, supply chain, and external stakeholder relationships, the products, services, and programs of the city of Kenmore, the inclusive culture and whether or not it's sustainable across the organization. We looked at the HR lifecycle process, the policies, processes, and procedures to advertise, to recruit, to hire, and onboard, and what the experience looks like in terms of mentorship, succession planning, sponsorship, building the bench to promote people from within into more senior roles. And then finally, DEI principles and strategic objectives, whether or not there is a DEI framework with deliberate and intentional actions with performance measures so that you're always centering equity and holding yourself accountable for that work. So this is what we looked at in terms of the SWOT analysis. The first thing that we looked at was whether or not there was an inclusive culture within the city of Kenmore and across the community. So we looked at whether or not there were mechanisms being provided for people to be heard, information in and information out across the city and across the community. Collection and review of DEI data for workplace and workforce, whether or not there was an articulated inclusive behavioral expectation broadly. Did leaders expressed that DEI was part of the DNA and culture of the organization, and was that modeled in what was shared in terms of communication and expectations for staff and themselves. Report, review, and evaluate, and then adjust plans. Lean process improvement. Did we set a goal? Did we review? Did we assess where we are in terms of the goal to course correct and then move forward under a better framework? And then, of course, to prioritize, promote, and promote DEI principles and objectives. So what did we find in terms of the city of Kenmore? Well, the first piece of good news is that there were no existential threats. So there was nothing that required immediate attention and intervention in terms of whether or not there was an inclusive culture. But what did we find in terms of strengths? So some of those immediate strengths for the city of Kenmore: the mission, vision, and business strategy shares an overt articulation of DEI as a priority. And it was mentioned specifically what we found: building on the strength and diversity, inclusive and family friendly. So it was already shared deliberately and intentionally. It's being messaged in the city that DEI matters and it's a priority for the city. Supports local arts, culture, and history. Needs to be intentionally inclusive with recognized experts from BIPOC communities. So right now, the city of Kenmore is doing deliberate outreach with BIPOC communities as they build on the arts program and art history, in building the culture and being intentionally inclusive and bringing in those expert voices in the area. Religious statement and holiday policy affirms a DEI perspective. So the city's policy around holidays is inclusive of more than one faith community. So it looks at the diverse representation of all of the community and is recognizing and bringing those perspectives into the fold. Cultural competency and implicit bias training for both city staffs and city councils. So those deliberate intentional conversations around bias are happening. Weaknesses. So the Sound Cities Association is a collective of local city governments that are able to come together to sound cities and share what their own activities and actions are. And Sound Cities is able to assess those, benchmark them against their neighbors, but most importantly, able to share tools, information, and resources for those member cities to be able to grow and improve in many different areas. And in that SCA report, there was no activity reported by Kenmore with intentional engagement, but leveraging the community advisory to mitigate change. Those actions are not articulated. So the city of Kenmore is going to need to do a little bit more and share that story. So if things are happening, they need to be able to report out on those things so that there's some transparency that will encourage accountability. But right now, there's the lack of an intentional strategy. But I know that is something that they're working toward. Some great opportunities where the door is open to be able to do things, where some seed is planted today, but they need to make sure that they cultivate that soil. Consider a more focused or expanded engagement survey to talk about DEI elements more specifically. Use best friend question potentially problematic from an inclusion perspective. So using the idea of a best friend, given the demographic of the city of Kenmore, where the vast majority of the population is Caucasian, non-Hispanic, but having a question talking about a best friend, especially that terminology like that is not as broad or inclusive. So sometimes having buzzwords like that can be limiting. An opportunity, the EEO statement in the policy document could be augmented to add context to the criticality of DEI as stated in the VMS document. So specifically what the city of Kenmore should look to do is talk about how DEI, how diversity, equity, and inclusion is critically important, that it is a goal and intention to increase diversity. So the EEO statement shares that it's not discriminatory, but it would go a long way to talk about some intentionality, some importance, and why DEI is significant for the city. The anti-harassment policy could also stand to add context and connection to DEI. So it's broadening and expanding the definition and statement to be more intentional in the verbiage that diversity and equity and inclusion is considered and as part of anti-harassment that especially with regard to DEI, that sort of harassment won't be tolerated. The general policy, statement requires, again, context and connection to DEI. The community advisory for DEI at that point was in progress, and it represented a mechanism to include community voice. But guess where we are today? That body is seated, and that body is you. So you are an opportunity for the community to have a voice in this conversation and in the process. Let me stop for a second and break and allow for members of the task force, because we have several different sections that we're going to get through, but I want you to be able to respond to what you see here. Is any of this surprising? Do you have any insights? Is there something, do you have any questions regarding this where you want more information or clarification?
Shannon, just to clarify, could you tell us again, I don't quite understand what the best friend question is. In some of the acronyms or abbreviations, EEO, VMS.
Oh, yeah. So equal employment opportunity. So the equal employment opportunity data is that data that a city would share that is mandated by the federal government, where an organization shares their workforce composition. So a city or a company or an organization would report how many people of color in every category work for the city. So the organization will report how many white or Caucasian, non-Hispanic people, Latinx, African American or Black, Indigenous, Native, Pacific Islander, women, veterans, people with disabilities. So you would report that workforce composition. The reason that an organization would report that workforce composition is because in this country, there have been long-term patterns and practices of discrimination against marginalized groups. And the only way that the government can be assured that progress is being made is to, and hold organizations accountable, is to look at the workforce composition. And when you know that an area, because when people do this reply to the census, they share lots of different information as individuals and as members of families, and you can tell from that census data what the jobs are, what your income level is, if you have any religious background or affiliation, your primary home language or other languages at home, your education, levels of education, what industry do you work in, all of those things. So a lot of that information is shared. The government retains, tracks, and analyzes that. So when you look at an organization, for example, like the city of Kenmore in this case, and you know that there is a certain percentage of the population that has the requisite skills, education, and background to do STEM-related jobs. And you look at the companies in the region or the area that offer STEM-related jobs, and if you see that there's a robust group of women with those degrees in the skill set, or people of color under those different categories, or people that have that self-identify as having a neurosensory or physical difference, the government knows that those people are part of the availability pool. And if you never see them in the workplace, then you can ask organizations, how is it that you have so many people that can do these skills in your local community, but none of them ever work in these organizations? Then you can hold organizations accountable, and quotas are illegal, but what you can say is, as part of an affirmative action strategy, cast a wide net, identify those obstacles or barriers to presenting opportunity within your organization for those populations. And let's do all that we can to encourage participation and increase opportunity or access to all of these opportunities for everybody in the community. And so, yes.
Excuse me for interrupting your spiel there. So this page on inclusive culture for the city of Kenmore, divided up into those 4 to 3 categories.
Yeah.
Those are categories that came out of a policy statement that somebody in Kenmore drew up. Is that what it is?
No, we looked at 9 different documents, came up with a set of different a group of insights based on an international standard of diversity and inclusion best practices, doing a SWOT analysis, and these are the results of that analysis.
And so who is we?
It would be my firm.
So your firm came up
Yes.
with this.
Yes.
Okay, I thought that you were saying that this was a policy statement that the city of Kenmore had drawn up and that we were being asked to comment on it and evaluate it.
No, no. So the city of Kenmore, so Leonora and the city manager's office sent us documents that are governing documents, policies, and processes that the city has in place. We did an assessment of those documents, a SWOT analysis of those documents through the an international best standard in terms of diversity and equity, and then offered this assessment of those city documents. Oh, you're on mute. Go ahead, Peggy.
So why does the SCA reports on what you've done?
They don't report on what I've done. They've reported on what the city of Kenmore has presented to them. So the city of Kenmore is part of the Sound Cities Association, and they share their efforts and some of their practices with them.
I see.
So,
Okay.
so if you did a Google search of Sound Cities Association, you would see that the city of Kirkland has shared what their efforts are. You'll see that maybe Issachar, I believe, has shared efforts. Kenmore and Seattle, maybe Pasco. There's lots of cities that are part of that collective, and so they've shared those things. So we looked at the Sound Cities Association report to see what the city of Kenmore has shared in terms of their efforts, and we included that as part of the analysis.
Okay, okay, you've answered my question. Thank you.
Yep. Peggy?
You've answered my question. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Peggy.
Can you give a little bit more context for this best friend question? It appears to be part of the engagement survey that was asked of City of Kenmore employees. Do you have the question so you can read it to us? Because it does sound like it could be potentially misleading or well, just from the way the sentence is written, it's just an interesting way to ask an engagement survey.
Yeah, I don't have the survey with me today. We did do an assessment of it, and our recommendation to them is that they look at using different language.
Okay. I'm sorry, one more question just to follow up. So, even though you don't have the question at hand, what was the intent of the question? Is it something like, do you have a friend within your, like, you know, within like 5 of your best friends that's a minority?
What we can do for the next meeting to book in on this is Leonora, can you make a note that we should pull the survey and bring that question, and we can provide that to the task force members to look at ahead of the meeting, and then we can engage in just a little bit of conversation for follow-up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one more question. Peggy, are you finished with your questioning?
I am, yes, thanks for asking.
Okay, Shanine, just one more question on my part.
Mm-hmm.
What triggered your being hired by the city of Kenmore?
Leonora, do you want to answer that? Why did the city of Kenmore hire me?
So Carlos, DEI was actually something that they wanted to focus on prior to my arrival last year. That being said, with all the events that had taken place, Kenmore was ahead of the game. And so we wanted to essentially, we wanted to get involved more in the community and make sure that everything that we do is going to be looked at through a DEI lens. We wanted to make sure that there were going to be accountabilities. We wanted to make sure that Kenmore was a comfortable place for people to work and live. And so it was really important for us to spearhead this, and we moved forward with a selection process of contractors who would be helping to shepherd our city through this process.
Okay, thank you, Leonora.
You're welcome.
I kind of guessed that, and but I didn't really know whether that was the case. But you basically answered my question. I'm not questioning Shanine. I'm just questioning why the whole thing came up.
So this is something that was really important to us. at the city.
Yeah,
And so
okay.
we really wanted to get ahead of this. And that's why we selected, or we went through an RFP process, and Shannon was selected through a competitive process to help shepherd us through.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We also looked at the human.
Oh, sorry. Sam has his hand up too.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Sam.
Hi, so looking at your general wording, sorry, my dog. Looking at the general wording, it looks like your anti-harassment policy would have been written by your team. Is that correct?
No, we didn't write any of these documents. Again, the documents were sent to us for review. We did an assessment of the documents, and then this is our findings of currently in force City of Kenmore policies, process, documents, or structures.
Okay, and then would this anti-harassment policy help specifically for like people hate criming specifically on race, or would it also help like members of the LGBTQ community, or like hate crimes against religion, or how else would this help?
An anti-harassment policy it doesn't on its own stand as a hate crime policy. The City of Kenmore would fall under the jurisdiction of those laws and rules set forth by the Constitution of the State of Washington. It is part of King County, so King County rulemaking, but also specifically policies that are drawn up, written, and adopted by the council and local government. So there's a lot of, in terms of anti-harassment policy, there's a lot of protections that people in the community, even in Kenmore, would enjoy in Washington State. But the city's policy, the city's own anti-harassment policy, particularly for its workforce, our recommendation was that it expand the language and make sure that they connected it to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and included that as an element in that policy.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and Sam, I'm really glad you asked that question, because that is something that we have an opportunity to improve. These are existing policies that were in effect for quite some time. And so that's why we're coming up with this, our own DEI policy to change what's already existing. And that's why we're enlisting your help. So thank you for those meaningful questions, everybody. This is really helping us.
Yeah. Go ahead, Juanita.
Yes, I had a question. I know I saw some of the spreadsheets for the North Shore School District. Is there going to be a bridge between Kenmore and the students of the community? Like, do they have their own task force? I know that when we do like a social program, if we want to aim at the kids, we go where the kids are, which is in school. So they have their own task force and to be listened to, and their ideas and innovation and their passion comes through. Is there going to be a bridge between schools and in the city, the students?
Right. I know that there is an effort made to include student perspective and voice. Even for this task force, it was advised that the city reach out to the school district, and especially the high schools, and to solicit participants for students to participate in this body, which is how Sam came to be here. In terms of other task forces, that's not part of the scope of the work or the process that we're doing. We're going to be partnering and engaging across all of the community in terms of survey and focus groups. But right now, we can't speak to that, to this process.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Another thing that we covered as part of the analysis was we looked at those documents shared with us representing the HR life cycle impacting the workforce for the city of Kenmore. We looked at workforce planning, recruitment and onboarding strategies, learning and development or training opportunities, growth opportunities within the city in terms of the learning path. We looked at performance management, specifically the current workforce. How does the city plan for essentially building their bench strength so that they support, nurture, grow, and build opportunities so that the folks that you have today become the leaders in the organization as a workforce tomorrow. We looked at workforce mobility and whether or not people could move and transfer among and around and between different opportunities across the city. When we assessed the documents shared by the city, this is what we'd found. In terms of strengths, the engagement survey results indicated a positive outlook for advancement and promotion. So employees shared or felt that that they saw that there was opportunity to grow within the city's government. Flex scheduling noted in the policy document links to affirming workforce mobility and ISO DEI standards. So when we looked at the document, we looked at international best practices, making sure that giving people different options and affirming those options in terms of mobility was important, and that was present. There's a higher education policy, and even within the higher education policy, included in that policy is the opportunity for people to substitute for some roles in lieu of education to have years of experience. That opens up the doors for many people as well. Some of the weaknesses that we saw right away, also in the engagement survey, there were lower scores on clarity of expectations that can lead to disparate results. So people weren't clear on the expectations always of how to measure for their performance and learning opportunity. They weren't sure of how do you get from where I am to that next thing. They saw that opportunity was to be had, but there needed to be more clarity around what that path looks like forward. There was poor communication on job performance to stakeholders. So people, it seemed that the city of Kenmore could do a better job of communicating how well people were doing, revisiting for employees in that annual performance evaluation, what it means, what it looks like, and where people are and what they need to do specifically to grow and improve. In the Sound Cities Association report, it doesn't call out Kenmore for equitable hiring and retention. So even in the assessment of Sound Cities, when they looked at Kenmore's efforts, they noted that there didn't appear to be at least a specific articulation around equity for hiring and retention. Some great opportunities where seeds have been planted, where things are happening, and the city could really lean into these open opportunities. Remuneration or equity opportunity to ensure pay equity at all levels. So looking at pay and the gradation of pay or the system for pay, this is a great opportunity right now, since the conversation is being had, to make sure that pay equity exists at all levels within the organization. The anti-discrimination statement in recruiting is important, but what's needed is for there to be attention to create a workforce that is demonstrative of the demographic of the community, of the state, and of the nation. So the city needs to include in it, in that language, that the goal of their anti-discrimination policy, the goal of their workforce policy, is to ensure that their workforce is reflective of the world around it. The recruiting effort of the policy document regarding recruiting should be an integrated part of the integrated succession planning, or there should be at least a structural linkage to the city manager role as well. So there should be a policy in place as we are working to do this work, or as we're working to build the equity policy. There should be some deliberate intentionality around recruiting, so that you talk about succession planning, so that people should know what the growth path looks like to do everything from the most entry level to ascend to a city manager's role. So if you are a part of the director's team and you're a direct report to the city manager, are there transferable skills? Is there a learning and leadership development plan that would allow people to know what is it that I need to know, do, or understand in order to grow into that next role? So there should be a more clear policy or document articulating that. Ensure that pre-employment exams minimize bias. So there are pre-employment exams now that exist for some roles across the city. And there should be an intentional effort to make sure that you assess those exams and eliminate any biases that could exist. There should also be a look at the trial period for terminations for any disparate outcomes. So while terminations are happening, there should always be an assessment to make sure that when the workforce is contracting, when there are layoffs, if there are terminations. Look at those numbers and ensure that there is not a move automatically. Sometimes in the workforce, when you're increasing diversity, people will say last one hired, first one fired. Sometimes part of those roles that you eliminate, especially if they're lower level roles, for the city of Kenmore, more people in leadership positions happen to be people who are Caucasian, non-Hispanic. When the city has to contract sometimes and you have to shed staff or lay off, or you let go staff as part of terminations, it's important to do a disparity study to make sure that you are not letting go of what essentially is some of your most diverse workforce. So to make sure that there's no disparity and bias or discrimination as part of that process. So that represents an opportunity for the city. Some of the threats in terms of, remember we talked about transparency and accountability. Share the equal employment opportunity data for city employment with all of the population and all the community. Make sure that it's in a place that's visible and that's visible and easily accessible, so that everyone like you and everybody in the community can see and access that. Make sure, because what we found is that the link to promotions and transfers policy to structured process, we want to make sure that right now, when you're talking about policies impacting opportunity, especially growth into leadership roles, don't link promotions and transfers to things that are not real. Don't have a policy where someone is in an acting role and it becomes an assigned role where there's not a competitive process. So things like that. Having a frame for a structured performance appraisal process training vis-a-vis DEI training. Make sure that when you're doing training where you're structuring the process to assess and assign value or to offer promotion, incorporate a DEI lens into that so that there's deliberate and intentional thinking where you're being challenged to ensure that there is no bias introduced in that policy. Also, expanding the training policy to include appropriate DEI training for every level. So I know that for the city, we did some DEI training in this last several months. But there should be a deliberate and intentional effort to make sure that there are competencies which are really core and essential skills and knowledge required of executives, core and essential skills and knowledge for people managers, core and essential skills and knowledge for individual contributors, where we talk about DEI as a best practice and how do you incorporate that learning into every layer across the organization. And then finally, monitor discipline policy for disparate outcomes. Make sure that some people aren't being disciplined at rates that are higher than other people, especially if they are marginalized populations. Lily?
Wow. I'm impressed by the work that you have been doing, and also, Lenora, that the city was willing to really put it all out there, And I wonder from you, Lenora, if you can share, what was the reaction of the leadership in the city to these findings? I know we're still going through them, but some of them are pretty material and kind of an eye-opener, right? And I wonder what the reaction was.
Actually, I would probably channel that back to Shannon, because Shannon was able to do one-on-one interviews with all the leadership team.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a separate report for that's going to be presented to this group as a result of those conversations. I did one-on-one interviews with everyone on council and everyone in the city manager's office and the director's team. So I have separate insights for that. But what I'll tell you is this: leaders have been asking for this information. They wanted this information, and they wanted it shared with the community, and they wanted it shared with you. They wanted to have open, honest conversation where sometimes it would be painful or uncomfortable. And I know that for City Manager Colenzi, Rob wanted to make sure that good, bad, or indifferent, that sharing this information means that we know what we have to fix. So you have both the strengths, the weakness, the opportunities, and the threats. You can't fix what you don't know. And what I found in the city manager for the city of Kenmore is that he is an incredible champion of this work. He wants to move forward with what's going to be best for the staff and for the community. And they specifically asked for this task force to exist, to be able to see this information, to assess the information, and to offer insights, good, bad, or indifferent, so that you, the community, can be part of the path forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so Shanine, what you have just explained right now, your last explanation is really very helpful because it gives me a better idea of how some of this information came to be, how it was put together. You're interviewing members of the city council and so on, so that's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the other comment that I have about what you're showing us here is that some of these paragraphs, for example, would profit from my point of view, and I don't know who else might feel the same way, would profit from maybe a little bit of an example. For example, weaknesses, second paragraph, poor communication of job performance to stakeholders. Now, when you mention that, you might have opened it up orally as you spoke about it. But for me, it would have been helpful to see a tiny little example of what that meant. The same with opportunities. First paragraph, remuneration, opportunity to ensure pay equity at all levels. I mean, it's a very idealistic concept. It's very noble in many ways, but where is it anchored in reality, at least in terms of Kenmore? That's my comment.
Yeah. And what I'll tell you is, again, the documents that the city of Kenmore shared in terms of their policies around pay equity, in terms of how they structure pay and whether or not that exists as a policy, that is the opportunity. So the city of Kenmore is working to redefine organizational roles, the hierarchical structure, and even the organization chart. And while that work is happening, the opportunity that is present is for them to also look at pay equity at all of those levels. Peggy?
Thank you. So this is really quite incredible. I think my comment is a little bit like Carlos's, which is, I'm not clear how to give you feedback because this is so broad and we haven't read any of the policies. So really, it seems like we're giving you feedback on what you have noted, which all seems very reasonable. But are there certain aspects of this grid that you particularly want comments on or for us to zone in on? Because otherwise, some of our comments could be very popcorny. It could be all over the place if we're not focused.
Yeah, I think that the feedback that we're looking for specifically is, so when you look at the things that are strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats, does something stand out where you want for us to give more information? So for example, you wanted to look at the policy specifically. So Leonora, what we can do is, she's noted that there's a question regarding policy. We can certainly make the documents that were assessed available to you. So we can create a file and send that to you so that you can take a look at what those things were yourself, or look at the surveys yourself. And then, you could offer more questions, but even for the purposes of tonight, we wanted to find out things like, will the city, so since this thing came up for training, is, one of the questions that I'd expected was, is there plans to have, since, these are threats, are there plans in place to make sure that there's training? Can make sure that, because that comes up, to incorporate that DEI element into all of these policy areas. Maybe your recommendation is make sure that the city council knows that since this comes up a lot, that we'd like to see them consider increasing the budget for that. In terms of the DEI policy related to harassment, for Sam, my takeaway is that Sam has made the connection that, how does this impact hate crimes? How does this impact different communities within the community? I would want to make sure that the language is broad and very inclusive, that maybe that anti-harassment policy makes it clear how that connects with hate crimes and include that into the information.
Yeah.
Sam?
Oh,
Sorry.
may I just finish one more thought and I'll pass this on to Sam. Can I ask that just when we see big grids like this, given that it's so much information to process, in the future, could there be maybe one question that is asked so that we can all participate in whatever it is that you might be interested in? So for example, you mentioned training. Maybe it's something that we can focus specifically on training to make sure that it's inclusive of all of our backgrounds and, just basically the feedback that we have. It just might make this conversation a little bit more focused and more useful for the city of Kenmore. So thank you, Sam.
I see you, David. I'll come to you in just a sec. So I'm going to go to Sam, then David, and then Carlos.
So one of the questions about the expand training policy to include appropriate DEI training for every level, would this just be for like anyone employed within the city of Kenmore, even if they don't like live in the city of Kenmore? If they're employed in the city of Kenmore, then they would have to undergo training policies, or how would that work?
That would be for people that work for the city of Kenmore.
So like specifically working for the city, not like employment within the city, but just
Exactly.
like employment for the city. Okay.
Exactly. So so folks that work for businesses that are located in the city of Kenmore, they would be responsible for their own worker training and things like that. This is for Kenmore's workforce specifically. David?
And so is it me?
Hold on just a second, Carlos. Go ahead, David.
Hello. From your assessment of all the documents that Kenmore didn't have a policy in place prior to for recruiting a diverse workforce, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So is that, so because of that, the employees of Kenmore doesn't reflect the actual makeup of the city of Kenmore, is that correct?
Kind of. Let me explain the nuance to that. So number one, having a policy would require to have a process. And so while the city of Kenmore doesn't currently have a policy around that, they also don't have a process. So there is no intentional strategy in place where they do an assessment of that EEO data, where they assign a specific strategy to have to cast a wide net. So who does the city of Kenmore go to in order to influence top of the funnel? What are some of those activities that would require or beg for them to get a more diverse workforce? And having the diverse workforce is only born of intentional efforts to recruit for a diverse candidate pool. So having a policy to get a diverse candidate pool would allow for you to then at least have the ability to increase the diverse workforce.
So the city's going to do the DEI training with all their hiring staff. Now, is there any way of figuring out how does it actually take? Because I know people can do these, seminars or their trainings and they're like, okay, I'm putting in my 2 hours, I'm good. And then have no follow-up on their intentions to like actively go out and recruit or give, the BIPOC person the benefit of the doubt when they're going through the hiring process, which I know.
You've asked a great question. And what I'll tell you is, after having talked to leaders, and I asked specifically, do you use data to inform your decision making, especially as it relates to DEI? And currently they don't. So that goes to your point. So, my recommendation to them in the report that you'll see after it's presented to the city manager's office next will be, you've got to be able to collect and share that data and let that data inform both the necessity for the policy, but also help build and design of strategy. But also there has to be data to look at performance measure, to look at the impact of the initiative, because you do a thing and you want to know, is this thing that we're doing meaningful? Is it getting us the results that we'd hoped? Or can we accomplish the goals that we've set out as a result of these things that we do, whatever they are. So I think that you're absolutely spot on to raise that as an issue. So what we know then is that, this is a thing that's come up in this task force that's important, that collecting the data, sharing the data, and making decisions based on it, but most importantly, looking at impact. Thanks for that call out, David.
Thank you.
Carlos? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm just echoing some remarks that Peggy made earlier, that these paragraphs here on this page reflect a very fine targets or intentions, and we're supposed to, I think our job is to affirm them or confirm them and accept them as something that should go forward. And my problem is that I don't know how they got here and what they all mean, because they're pretty general ideas. But what you're saying is beginning to explain all that. So I can see that. So that's all I'm saying at this point.
Mm-hmm. And really, my sharing this report with you isn't for you to adopt its findings or for you to approve its findings. It's really for you to react to what you've seen, so that if this if any questions that you have come up from having seen this, or if you want to ask, well, what, do you have any indication that they're going to be doing this thing, or we see this a lot? Why aren't they thinking of adding this other thing? So I don't want to give you just one or two questions that will put you down a certain path to go down a specific rabbit hole. I want you to be able to look at it in its totality and react to it. If it generates questions for you, or it begs a response where you're going to say, well, why doesn't the city do this thing, or have they considered some other thing? Because if these come up as weaknesses or threats, maybe they should think about doing, and then you tell me, what do you think they should be thinking about doing? Go ahead, David. I see your hand still up. Did you have a question still?
I did not, sorry.
I'm sorry. Another area that we looked at and assessed was leadership and accountabilities. The establishment of DEI expectations and accountabilities for across the city. Role modeling inclusive behavior, setting behavioral expectations for the workforce, ensuring that the organization's systems, policies, processes, and practices align with its DEI principles, goals, and objectives. Allocating resources to achieve a DEI objective. Report, review, evaluate, and adjust plans to ensure that things are moving in the direction that you hoped. So when we looked again at those documents shared, we didn't find any existential threats. We found a lot of strengths, though, in terms of leadership and accountabilities. The vision, mission, strategy, specifically for the Love of Kenmore, positive value attribute can be leveraged for DEI effort overall. There is more that connects us. So more of that language in terms of DEI and connection building, collaborative community, what's expected. So, if you speak it, then it matters. What you measure matters, what you say matters. So setting the tone and expectation. Again, the engagement survey verbatims, talking about culture and teamwork. So measuring that, asking it, assessing it, measuring it to be held accountable for it. having a statement in the policy document, specifically the primary mission that ties to values to do this more often. Having city resolutions overtly articulate DEI priority. So there's a clear tie to that as a best practice. I know that there is a proclamation that is forthcoming regarding Juneteenth. There are things regarding the city's commitment to DEI and inclusive culture and those things. So strong, a very strong attribute. Also allocating resources for a DEI effort. It was a big push for the city of Kenmore to allocate money, staff time. You have a DEI, you have an HR director that also wears the hat for DEI manager, having them bring this function into the city to be deliberate and intentional to assess this. So putting resources to this effort. Even the fact that the website, the city of Kenmore's website articulates their DEI efforts. So talking about what they do, sharing what they do, open and transparent and putting that information out there, sharing who's on the task force, and allowing for the community even to have access to see these meetings are all strengths. One of the weaknesses that we found, cultural diversity programming, is always an opportunity to extend the commitment and to articulate that into action. So the SCA report did not share at all that there was any cultural diversity programming happening in the city at the time that they shared it. Is that happening now? It's happening more now, but in the documents that were shared, when you look in the rearview mirror from this path from 2021 and beyond, or before then, just didn't exist in the documents shared. An opportunity right now, especially through the engagement survey, there's a general upward trend for the engagement index for over the 51st percentile. So it looks like right now the target is low to look for a positive sentiment at 51%. A more appropriate target is probably something in the 80-85 percentile. So raising the bar and reaching for a higher bar. So look to increase for more appropriate goal, demonstrating an aggressive upward trend. Lily?
I have a question for you regarding the engagement survey, because it appears that you used it for a lot of purposes and got a lot of information from it. So I have a few questions. First, can we take a look at that survey, see what it looks like? I'm curious to read the questions. I have surveys like this for my employer. They are dragging, and I end up just clicking yes, 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 because I'm exhausted sometimes with 50 questions. So I'm wondering what the city's survey looks like, what your impression of it. I assume you've seen many of them. Mm-hmm. And also, if the city plans on incorporating DE&I into that survey to measure results.
Yeah, we can certainly bring that forward and have it available for you so that we can discuss it at a future meeting. Nancy?
Yeah, thank you. Very clear the intentional, thoughtful work that you and your team have brought. And as I am hearing you speak and finally formulating thoughts, I just had something I did want to clarify. One thing I wanted to clarify, that it seems like we are looking, and our goal as a task force are looking at policies for both Kenmore, City of Kenmore staff, like DEI within the workforce, and then also applying that lens to policies that are external, public facing. So it's both within our team internally working to look at like racial equity, inclusion in general for the workforce, and then also applying that lens to the work that's done out in the community. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Because the City of Kenmore, first and foremost, exists as an organization that has a workforce. And so we want to make sure that we did an assessment of the organization as a workforce, but we also wanted to look at the output of their efforts and as a service to the city.
Absolutely. And some things that I think you've already mentioned too, and I feel like apply to this leaderships and accountability section and some of the other sections is this conversation around measurement and analysis that you've already started talking about. Like, is the city, as we're thinking about these goals and opportunities and aspirations, what does our plan for measurement and analysis look like? Asking the question, like, what does success look like? So not necessarily a checkbox kind of approach, but definitely like, how do we know we're going down in the right, what are our guiding stars? We're going down the right path, never like, you know, we got there, great. But I think having that approach to planning that we know the direction that we're going. So just wondering if that's like maybe part of these opportunities or conversations that you're having with the team as you're talking about through these different topics.
That is loosely, but the fact that you've just called it out means that that can happen concretely. So what I've taken from your statement is that the city of Kenmore needs to really think about what success looks like, how you measure that, and how you share it. So that was my take. That was my biggest takeaway from you to include and to share.
That was a really helpful summary.
Thank you.
One other thing too, so under opportunities, it seems like part of the review process perhaps, so we talked earlier about succession planning or promotions and a clear pathway to higher organizational leadership positions. And I'm wondering if part of this conversation too is if we're centering DEI and saying that that's a really important part of City of Kenmore staff culture as well, because the people who are working there are reflecting that in the work. Like, is there a possibility of looking at review metrics or analysis? So as we're having annual reviews for folks, are there competencies and goals and objectives that people are actively working towards? And it feels like that can make it more like baked into the process of that's how you keep growing in the city of Kenmore.
I think that that's an excellent call out. And I think that stands as and I think more than a question, it stands as a good recommendation. So what I take from you then is the recommendation that the city look at those metrics regularly, have annual reviews toward an individual employee's goals toward the accomplishment of those DEI competencies. So I think that that's a great call out. Thank you for that.
If I have just one more last thing, and then I will stop taking up so much space, but it also feels related to leadership and accountability of the different toolkits. And we may be able to, like you were talking about, we're looking maybe at policies and refining them and updating them. Some, it sounds like, have been around for a very long time. Are we considering using like a racial equity toolkit as we're looking at policies? I think like City of Seattle or King County has various toolkits that they may use when they look at budgeting or when they're looking at planning. I'm kind of going through that set transparent process to either refine and update policies, or as we're writing them to have, again, that kind of structure that we're really centering equity or DEI.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great call out, because the output goal of the work that the council is doing is for you to be able to review and assess the racial equity policy that we're going to be building. And so I think that your call out that if the policy, if the city's going to create that policy, my takeaway from your statement is that there should also be a toolkit so that they'll have the resources or the information that they could leverage, so that when they apply that racial equity policy to their decision-making around budget, around programming, around planning, and all of the work that the city is doing for the community, that they should be able to apply that racial equity policy, or not just racial equity, it's an equity policy, but they can use the equity policy to also apply the lens of racial equity to all of their decision-making as well. So I think that that's a good call out. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Leonora, you're on mute.
Thank you. I just wanted to share with the team, although it says it's talking about the 51st percentile under opportunities compared to other public sectors, we actually were top. We were our range was in the top. So I just wanted to share that.
Lenora, do you mean that the engagement level from 1 to 100 is 51?
Yes, from that. No, oh, no, excuse me. I'm sorry. What I was mentioning is in comparison to the other organizations that participated, compared to other public sector, other organizations in the public sector, we were on the top end.
But what that means, Lily, is that they've set a low goal. We're saying that the goal should be higher, not where they place, but there should be a higher goal, because they could come in at in terms of the engagement index for positive engagement at 60%. That would be low on a 100-point scale, but because they're over the 51st percentile, then it seems like it, at the 60th percentile, it seems like that they're achieving higher, but that's still low. So we're saying increase that index to something more in terms of the 85th percentile, and let that always be the thing that you're shooting for. Because when you set the bar low, you can squat down and reach the goal. We think that in this area, you should set the bar high and reach for the higher bar.
Yes, so although it reflects that we were high in our scores in comparison to other organizations in the public sector, we still want to be higher than we are right now, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
We also looked at external stakeholders in terms of emerging themes. So having a recognition of the external stakeholder value of the community. And so we're talking about outside of our four walls now, because before it was, kind of more inwardly facing, but what does that look like when it's outwardly facing? Developing the development of an engagement strategy and implementation outreach. Communicating DEI principles, document and review with stakeholders, monitor and review the influence and impact of stakeholder outcomes. How do the things that we do impact the folks that we're doing the work for as a municipality? Evaluate the results and whether or not it's sustainable, revise and adopt as required. So how do we deliberately and intentionally do outreach and engagement of the community, where we communicate out, but also get communication in? How do we listen and learn? How do we measure the impact of the policies, programs, and processes that impact the community, so that we know who we're touching, who we're reaching, and the impact of what we're doing, and whether or not it's successful? And then to look at that in terms of data, and to track and monitor the data, to make that information available to the community, and to assess everything along that continuum of process, and look at every different lever point where we touch the community, and make sure that at every stage we're achieving success. And if we're not at any place, that we can stop at that lever, reassess and course correct, so that we move forward on the path toward our ultimate goals. What did we find? Again, in this area, thankfully, no existential threats, but in terms of strengths, participation in the Sound City Association's equity program that offers benchmarking and a reapplication for positive and effective practices. So Sound City has an equity program. The city's participating in that. So that means they can get tools, resources, collaboration, benchmarking, and partnership. How is Kenmore doing? And what are others doing? What success do they enjoy? And can we share in that success? What can we learn from it? Can we mirror it, monitor it, collaborate across it? But at least there is, in the local area, opportunities to learn, grow, benchmark, and grow off of others. And you have this dedicated place to get that information. External acknowledgement of important heritage celebrations for the community, for the citizenry. So that stuff is happening. So communicating, celebrating, and recognizing it in the community. Organizational memberships and partnerships, partnering with local nonprofits, partnering with local governments, partnering with local businesses and individuals in order to build and grow relationships. So partnering across. Member of the government. City of Kenmore is a member of the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, or GARE. So strengths. Again, a weakness, there is no equity-focused campaign for the city of Kenmore per the SEA report. There's an opportunity to market and engage around the community for DEI. So the city has to have a dedicated DEI plan and strategy, and to be able to share that with Sound Cities and really hold itself accountable in that regard. So that, right now that's a weakness that it's not being recorded. There is no apparent policing policy or no documentation for or against as an issue here. So there's nothing that appears. There's nothing in terms of a policing policy that connects DEI as part of the work. So that represents an opportunity. I know that I've worked with Kenmore's police department with the which is contracted with King County. I've met with the department, I believe, in whole, and I can tell you, having had all of them in the room, there is an interest, there is an eagerness, there is an excitement, there's a commitment, there's a desire to be, and actually it's a diverse and representative group of officers. A small but mighty team of King County deputies that are contracted to do the work for Kenmore, but no apparent policing policy or documentation for or against DEI. This is an opportunity for that statement to be made. I know that the statement is made through King County. King County has a racial equity and social justice policy that doesn't trickle down into the city of Kenmore. So this is an opportunity to be intentional through the department to use that language, because it comes up a lot for the community. The community wants to know that that its police department is committed, is educated, and aware. And I can tell you, having sat in a room with the city's department, that the will is there. I want to make sure that the messaging matches what you hear in City Hall, that is translated out into the community. There's an opportunity to engage the community in educational perspectives and build a pipeline for participation in terms of civic education and City Hall 101. So you have that, you have the City Hall 101, you have civic education. And so I can't remember, someone brought it up earlier about connecting the schools with what's happening for the city. This is one of my recommendations that's called out as an opportunity. Connect the schools with what's happening at City Hall and to build that bridge. Go ahead, Nancy.
Hi, me again. It sounds like there is an element of like community engagement in this topic as we're talking about it, and I'm wondering if there are opportunities to kind of do that overlap with like a demographic analysis or community profile. You shared the spreadsheet that has a lot of that information, and I haven't had a chance to really dive super deep into it, but just wondering if, again, we're looking at how our community engagement as a city is meeting the needs of the different community members here. So not only in terms of like translated materials or interpretation, I'm thinking about if there are folks that maybe don't have consistent access to high-speed internet. One recent example I was thinking of is the city of Kenmore sent out a survey that I was able to take on the community members' feedback on how to use some of the American Rescue Plan funding that we have. And I was able to scan a QR code and take it online. So that was one method, and just wondering if, again, we can take the data that we have and just make sure like our community engagement, our sharing of information and engagement for all community members, we do have that overlap, and we're letting data drive like our different outreach methods that are high tech, low tech, different language accessibility. So just wondering if that might also be another opportunity that we could consider.
That is, and that was the reason you were shared, that extra data set was shared with you. So part of the packet that you have in prep for today was that whole community scan. So it looks at homelessness, it looks at kindergarten readiness, it looks at the different industries that people work in, what the representational diversity looks like, who in the community has insurance and who doesn't, and what age bands that impacts. So when you look at ARPA funds and how you want to invest funds, home ownership, rental, home, all of these different issues. So looking at who constitutes the community of Kenmore, identifies opportunities to build around that data. So that's exactly why you got that data as an overlay. So as we consider these things, we can use that data as a guide. It helps us set priorities. It helps us even in knowing what languages are being spoken by folks in the city of Kenmore. When we do a survey and we identify the top 5 languages other than English, we can make sure that if we're going to do that community-wide survey or do engagement, we're going to reach out to specific communities and help us understand, you know, what the translation should look like and in terms of documents, or that maybe having things all online and virtual won't help. So, you know, we cannot connect with folks who are housing insecure. We have to make sure that we're partnering with those organizations that are serving and servicing folks that are housing insecure, and go directly to those organizations and maybe do some things in person, or have some things that are, you know, kind of old school pen and pencil to work with staff on the ground in order to make sure that we get insights and hear from all of those different constituent populations. Also, we've learned that, you know, there's a lot of folks that are Spanish speaking that are living in trailer homes, and many don't speak English as a first language. So when we do outreach and engagement, it's clear that we have to have Spanish speaking outreach as part of the strategy for this work. So a lot of that data is informing this process. Jeannie?
Yeah, hi. I was kind of thinking as you were talking, you know, in particular, the policing policy was mentioned, but it kind of made me wonder, from the city of Kenmore's perspective, what are the ways that the city of Kenmore most touch the lives of citizens? Like, there's probably certain categories. There's a library, there's police, there's utilities, there's, I don't know, you know, trash pickup, there's, you know, a variety of ways that the actual government touches an individual's life. And so I'm wondering what the city feels that the priority areas are. You know, what are the main ways that the city touches the lives of its citizens? And then do we have any idea on the reverse side of that? What do the citizens think about how the city most impacts them? So it's like, what does the city think about their engagement, and what does the citizenry think about their engagement with the city? It's just a two-way thought process. And so I guess the point of me asking this is, so we're talking specifically on this opportunities about the police, but what about all of the other areas? Are there places where these other places that touch our lives need to be having policies in place around DEI, and how will we identify those?
Thank you so much for that question, Jeannie. One of the things that we're going to be doing as part of this process in the coming months is to do a survey of the community. And I think that what you've raised as a question would be a great opportunity. I'll make sure that we look at structuring a question for that survey that speaks just to that, so we can answer that question. Because what we've done in other cities is to also collect, as part of that volunteers, the survey that people will do voluntarily, is we get demographic data to be able to isolate or factor by neighborhood or by language spoken at home, to include American Sign Language, to look at level of income, racial background in different areas, so that when we start to get into the weeds and do to look at different populations within the population in terms of insight and sentiment, I would love to be able to look at the ways that the government interacts or engages that touch their lives the most in questions like that. This is being recorded, so we can go back and get a recording and get your question verbatim and see if we can't structure a question to be able to answer that question. So thank you for that. Lily?
Shannon, on strengths, I'm curious if the organization membership and partnerships, which is a good way to interact with the community, is it a strength because it exists, or is it a strength because it's already diverse?
Both. The first thing that you can do is have the relationship, and then the second thing is to leverage the relationship. not every city sees it as a priority to engage in these regular, meaningful, kind of mutually beneficial relationships. So the fact that you have staff that are participating in going to these groups specifically represents a strength. The fact that they would leverage the relationship is the icing and sprinkles on that cupcake.
And they are looking at diverse organizations that the city participates right now.
Yes. Juanita?
Yes, I had also a question about surveys and finding out. I would like to be a part of or see what the surveys are, because I would also like to know. I think an important thing to get from the community is where they feel safe to approach to talk about this. I did, when I was in school, I did an analysis of where art was in my community, and that was here, and it was in the parks. And I felt that that was a big part of where our community found that the parks were art, and they worked on the art, and there was like kids working on art projects and stuff. And so I know that's important to our community. And so as part of like a survey, hopefully that will be on there, whereas where you feel safe. And because I think that's important to know, because if somebody doesn't feel safe, that is, that's going to be important to understand why and how. And also, I want to know how the community is going to be getting information as far as why some of these things are important. Like, I know that art's important, but how does that affect the community, the expression psychologically, making you feel safe and included? How would they get access to the information, and to get access where they can understand, not just, I know, reading about it in a study, but having it delivered to them in language that they can understand and be familiar with, and feel safe and comfortable, and maybe be empowered by it to participate.
Thank you for that. And let me be able to reflect back what I've heard. At least the key takeaway of what I've heard. And again, we have a recording of the conversation, we can get it specifically, but my key takeaway from you is that included in a survey of the community, especially related to DEI and this policy, you would love to see a question that speaks to whether or not people feel safe, and then where they feel safe in the community. And then even to ask the question would require, at least in what I'm hearing from you, that if people don't feel safe, and we know that especially that it may come up in the survey, we want to make sure that we create a toolkit, or create a place to have information in at least multiple languages, so that people know where to go in terms of resources, in terms of places that are safe. But if they are not safe, or there is a need, we want to be able to provide for them the information that would close that gap for them.
Yes.
And to not just provide the information, to put it in a place, or have it in a modality that they can access it, and have it in languages that multiple people across the community can access it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we're almost done. Procurement and supply chain, or supplier diversity. Integrate and communicate DEI principles, objectives, and expectations in each stage of the procurement process. Kenmore is a city, but it's also an organization. It's effectively a public business. Engage in supplier outreach activities to identify a variety of potential suppliers, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, BIPOC or businesses owned by minorities, smaller micro businesses. Engage supply chain partners through supplier forums and feedback mechanisms to share and exchange. Collecting data on the activities related to the procurement and supply chain relationships, and then again, report, review, evaluate, and adjust plans. The City of Kenmore engages in commerce across a large business ecosystem? Does everyone have opportunity to do business with the city of Kenmore in the same way that you want to do business with the state of Washington or the federal government or King or Snohomish counties? How do those businesses do business and engage in commerce with the city of Kenmore? What we found is, number one, in terms of the weakness, Kenmore not seen as having a supplier diversity process according to the SCA report. So there is no supplier diversity program. Opportunities, the vision, mission, and strategy implementation, especially around the economic development plan, represents an opportunity to ensure supplier diversity efforts are integrated into the plan. So build a supplier diversity plan. The city budget and expenditures look for opportunities to support supplier diversity efforts. So as the city is doing RFPs, and make sure that you reach out to a supplier diversity network or forum, make sure that you partner with Tabor 100 or other organizations that support women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, those small micro businesses, to make sure that people understand the opportunities that exist, can leverage those things, but that the city has a policy that they are making sure that they have some intentionality around seeking, securing, and nurturing those relationships. Let me let y'all respond to that. I know there's not a lot there, but let me tell you, in terms of benchmarking, Kirkland didn't have a supplier diversity policy and it has had to build one recently. So, you know, this is not something that is common even across city government. So this is something that lots of people are working on today, especially since the spring of 2020.
Is this something that's seen in the federal government, though, or not?
This is the federal government has a very strong supplier diversity channel. You can register and be certified as a minority or women-owned business with the federal government, and that recognition can carry over across other organizations. The state of Washington, with the Office of the Office of Minority Women's Business Enterprise, OMWBE, also certifies minority and women-owned businesses in the state of Washington. My business has been certified with the state of Washington as both a minority and a women-owned business for the state of Washington. So the city of Kenmore, if they had a formal supplier diversity program, would be able to take credit for the fact that I would be considered part of their numbers because I'm a minority woman-owned business. So so they need to have that policy. Departments need to consider these things as they are creating expenditures of their own. I wanted to be able to just share, because I don't want us to leave it and not get this, because I know we're at time. Some of the early recommendations: increase staff resources to continue to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within the city of Kenmore. Incorporate DEI best practices into all facets of city policy, processes, and programs. Leverage data and set goals, appropriate goals, to assess both need and impact in strategic planning. So this is some of what you folks have shared that's coming back, especially you, David. Establish a permanent mechanism for regular, dedicated outreach and engagement with the community of Kenmore. Create a supplier diversity policy and program, and improve both external and internal communication of DEI goals, strategies, and performance measures. And so that's what we had in this plan. You all have a copy of this. You have the data community scan that we're using as an overlay of all of the work that we're doing in consideration of these things. But these are some of the early recommendations. I wanted to know, based on what you've seen, do you feel like these early recommendations capture at least a lot of the spirit of what has come up in the conversation tonight? Is there anything more you'd like to add to the early recommendations? I know that we've got the survey questions and the development of those toolkits for the community, especially for city leaders to be able to incorporate some of these best practices in what they do. Is there anything else?
Shannon, just to help us out, do you believe this incorporates all the weaknesses and threats? Did they exclude intentionally or unintentionally something?
Not to my knowledge. So there was an exhaustive list of organizational documents that we requested. What I'll say is this: Kenmore is not an old city. Kenmore is not a big city. Kenmore's staff is less than 60 people. So it's a new, it really is, relatively speaking, a newer government. And so it's not as mature as a lot of other cities in terms of the sophistication of its infrastructure. So the documents that they shared, that we did the assessment for, really represented, I think, as robust as we could get for a newer emerging city government. The city is growing exponentially. I think that they're going to have to look at increasing FTE to meet need, because even in terms of outreach and engagement, the city is so small and doesn't have as much staff right now that they couldn't even as part of this process do their own outreach and engagement. So part of my team is doing outreach and engagement on behalf of the city of Kenmore to make sure that we're having those intentional connections and conversations with organizations across the community and that support the community. So those conversations are being had, but we want to make sure that the city sets themselves up so that it's scalable and sustainable over the long haul. I hope that helps explain.
Yeah.
Good. Juliana?
Hi. One thing, all of this has been fantastic, by the way. Thank you so much. One thing that was discussed was how the city of Kenmore is both an employer, right? Like it is, its own insular employer. And then it's also like an external, community
service provider.
Thank you. And so one thing I've been thinking about is there also needs to be a safety in the community members feeling DEI protections when they engage with the city as a city. And I've sat in enough city meetings at task force to know that Rob Kerlindsey, the city manager, and so many members of our city council really strive to be a safe listening ear and not easily provoked. But I've also heard just enough meetings where sometimes I wonder about how safe the speakers feel when listening to other public comments. And how, there's comments earlier about where do people feel safe? And I think maybe that was somewhere like with parks or art or school. So I'm also thinking, do they feel safe engaging with the city? And we all need that. But also you mentioned at the beginning that the majority of Kenmore city leadership, was what? It was pretty top loaded as Caucasian, white. And if there's so many barriers of that's not healthy for a city, for people to not feel safe expressing themselves to city leadership. And also, if you are city leadership who's BIPOC's a minority, how many more barriers would you face in your position if you were exposed to pushback? So I guess I'm thinking, are there going to be any DEI goals that talk about that tension between the community engaging with the city and feeling like that safest space?
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. Thank you so much for that, Juliana. I want to be able to reflect back that when we think about the city of Kenmore as both an employer and as a service provider, we want to take into consideration psychological safety in terms of employees being able to share and express, but also the community, to make sure that all members of the community are able to have different mechanisms through which they can participate and offer insights. Because if they don't feel safe, and we want to be able to gauge whether or not they do feel safe engaging with city leaders, but even if we know that they don't, are there other ways that they can contribute? Because while they might feel that tension and that lack of comfort, not necessarily even safety, but a lack of comfort sometimes in sharing with the city leader, it can be intimidating when you know other people are participating in the conversation and maybe you don't want to say things because other speakers are saying things are in the room that you feel like you may be judged for your perspective. But having different mechanisms for people to share insights. So, people could speak and offer during the public comment for this meeting, but, some people may not feel comfortable speaking up even in this forum. So what other mechanisms exist so that people can do that? And while we work on creating those mechanisms, what can we do to create the safety in spaces so that then people will be comfortable to participate and make a public comment, for example, as opposed to having to send something anonymously through another channel. I hope that captures it.
It did. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Juanita?
Yes, I had a couple things. As far as you were saying, yeah, Kenmore doesn't have enough people to do outreach. How was your, because being a consultant from outside the community, were you having trouble as an outsider from being an outsider of the community in speaking with people from the community as far as their trust level? And how is that going to impact the knowledge going forward for people to the people that of City of Kenmore when they do their own outreach? What knowledge are they going to be given to do this? Is that going to be based on what you're giving them, or to be sustainable? How are they going to keep the cycle going as far as getting that information in community outreach? And one other thing, I just want to say, one of the blockers for me to participate tonight was that the information was sent out yesterday. I would have been much more prepared if I had a little bit longer than a day to go over this, just so that I can get more prepared as far as looking over things and looking up things, who the SCA, all that stuff. So I would, if information like this would be available earlier than a day, I'd be appreciative of that.
Let me tell you, I'll do the second thing first, and then I'll go to the first point. So to the second point, normally those things are provided much further ahead of time. We had trouble, we had to make sure y'all had emails, we had to have a method to get it to you, we had to transfer large data files. So normally you would have gotten this much sooner. I talked to, and I spoke with Nancy about that even, that she and I have worked out a place and a platform for me to put files, because generally they're produced a month ahead of time. So you have a promise and commitment that you'll get stuff much sooner to be able to review.
Oh, thank you.
And then to your first point about my connections to the community, I have lived in the Kenmore area for let's see, my son is at Wazoo. He's a freshman now. He's 18. I moved into the area when he was 6 months old. So I am from the Kenmore-Bothell area. I spent 15 years in the Kenmore-Bothell area. When I moved away, it was only 10 minutes away. So I'm still in the area. I am, I go I've been up and around Simons Road many times. I still do. I go to the donut shop and that was not there anymore, but I've been to the bowling alley, and I know the history of all of that. I've watched the Safeway on Bothell Everett be updated, upgraded. I go to the Yakima fruit stand still. So I'm very familiar. And I consider myself a part of. I've driven down Bothell Everett before they started charging the toll on the 520 and threatened it on 90. I've watched our traffic grow where people are trying to avoid the toll. So I feel like I have a good grounding and understanding of the local community. I've watched us get a new city hall in Kenmore. So I remember the old city hall, and even Ostrom's drugs. So I'm very much familiar with the community, grounded in the community, understand the community, and still feel connected to the community. So my team is in the area, at least the Washington-based staff. We're local, we know the area. So our outreach and engagement is coming from a place of knowledge of the local community. So I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. But also the insights and recommendations that will come, while I may be the person pulling it in at the top of the funnel, it's insights from you that are going to influence this. It's outreach to the local community that will impact this, and it'll be the survey of the community that will provide insights for this. So the city council and city leadership and you won't have to depend on my word alone. I'm the vessel to bring those voices, just like this task force. I may be facilitating, but you all in this process are going to be, strongly those voices. Leonora and I are just going to be the vessels. So I hope that helps. Go ahead, David.
Yes, thank you.
It's I had a comment about how you have been engaged with the Kenmore Police Department.
Mm-hmm.
And are they going to be kind of included within this process, or is that they're going to have their own process for DEI work? And are they going to be doing any surveying themselves on how they're interacting with the citizens of Kenmore and who they're interacting with?
If they do something like that in terms of their interaction with the community that's separate a part of this process, that would be something that the department would do as part of the King County Sheriff's Department. I know that they do a lot of work in that regard as part of King County. But are they engaged in this process? They will absolutely be engaged in this process and be partnered with it, because government is of the people, by the people, for the people, but it's also the people, and the police department are part of those people. So we'll be engaging with them alongside the rest of staff. So I did meet with who is the chief for the department. I met with all of those officers. We had a conversation around DEI. They got to ask me questions, talk about what it was that I was doing. I got invited to a luncheon and learn with the department. So I got to sit in a room with them. I haven't gotten to sit in the rooms with much of the staff, but the first group that I had the pleasure to sit in a room with was all of that small and mighty team. So when I say to you that I know that they understand this issue, I've discussed this issue with them, the importance that it has for them. You have a diverse, dedicated, and committed department that is actively engaging in these conversations and are very much a part of our chats.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Leonora, I wanted a time check. I know we're at 7:46. Everybody has a community scan. There wasn't really anything that we had to do in terms of covering that, but I wanted it to be captured on the agenda so that the community would know that scan exists as part of the documents that were made available to this DEI advisory task force. I wanted to, so we've talked about early recommendations, and we've gotten a lot of really great insight from folks. I wanted to, let me stop sharing screen here. I wanted to go back to the agenda, circle back, and I'm going to pivot and turn it back over to you so that if there was anything else that we needed to cover from your office, we can bring our meeting to close tonight.
Yes, you must have read my mind. So those are the two items I wanted to ask you about, Shannon, the community scan findings and community survey design task force input. So are these items that you wanted to move to a future meeting, or?
No.
Okay.
We don't need to move to a future meeting.
Okay.
And what we got from the group was the questions that I'd hoped to get. I wanted to just get some recommendations and insights from what they've seen of topics or ideas that they might want to see in a community survey. We've gotten some of that, but we can certainly circle back to that question again. So actually, let's move that question forward in terms of community survey, because what I'd like to do is give an early draft of what some of those questions or what those questions would be for a community survey, and then have the task force be able to look at those as part of an early packet to consider those, so that when we meet at a future meeting, we can look at some of the recommendations or insights for questions, let them see the questions in their totality, so that if they had any other questions, recommendations, or insights, we can get that from them at a future meeting as well.
Okay, thank you.
I want to make sure that keeping in the spirit of why the task force was seated, that they would be able to see what we were doing along the way and offer their insights, recommendations, or input.
Thank you. All right. Task force members, does anyone have any additional questions before we adjourn the meeting?
I had a question on the survey itself. We spoke a little bit about feeling safe and difficulties with language. Do we believe we accurately captured the representation of the minorities in the survey?
The survey is something that is to be done. We've not done the DEI survey yet. So the reference to the survey as part of this, the results and findings, was a survey that my firm didn't do. It was a survey done of the community previous, and we talked about making that information available for you, but this would not be that same survey. So we're talking about doing a DEI specific survey for the city of Kenmore, where we can talk about safety, we can talk about accessibility, connections, and other things.
Sorry, I misspoke. I meant the data that you sent, the community population profile.
Oh, yes. And what was the question regarding that?
We spoke about access to the minorities and do they feel safe to even respond to the survey? Do we feel like we captured the correct representation of the minority populations within Kenmore? And I'm asking that question because I noticed something interesting in that survey. The Latino representation and the overall population is one, but in the schools, it's much higher. And it made me think, did you capture all the Hispanics? Because I know they are in school, so there should be more people.
Yeah, well, for the city of Kenmore, that's tougher because Kenmore is part of North Shore Schools. North Shore Schools serves more than just the city of Kenmore, so the numbers reported by the school would capture multiple communities. So those numbers would be higher than you would find present in the population that's represented or reflected in Kenmore specifically, because North Shore Schools would capture the city of Bothell. It would capture the city of Kenmore, and so I think several unincorporated parts of the region.
Right, but the raw data has the Kenmore Elementary, for example.
Yeah.
And if you look at the percentage of Hispanics in the total population of the school, it's like 30%.
Yeah.
But Latinos in Kenmore is like 12%.
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. But and also keep in mind that 30%, when you look at the population size of an elementary school, it might, it could be 30%, but when you look at what that 30% represents, that total number could be, it could be 5 kids, it could be 30 kids. So it depends on the population size, but seeing something like 30% in a smaller population size, as opposed to the larger population size for the city proper of Kenmore, could be there could be a wide variance in terms of the actual head count of what's represented in that percentage.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Leonora.
So with that being said, I don't see any other hands. I would like to thank everybody for joining our second meeting, and the meeting is adjourned.